From the moment South Africa was moved to alert level 1 of the lockdown, social media users have felt the decision was influenced by the need for parties to campaign, essentially. When the ANC launched its election manifesto, Twitter users were less than impressed by the party asking voters to give them another chance. Last week, conversations were dominated by the Democratic Alliance's election poster controversy, the 15 million rand sports field and Action SA's lawsuit against the IEC, just some of the big election stories over the past week. So let's get you a sense of what's been tracked so far on Twitter from Stuart Jones, who is the Director of Projects at the Centre for Analytics and Behavioural Change. We'll also give you some analysis on this discussion with the Director of Programs at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, that's Ebrahim Fakir. To both of our guests, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Stuart, I want to begin with you because the Centre for Analytics and Behavioural Change is doing something particular insofar as election sentiment is concerned and tracking that sentiment on social media. Just take us through that particular segment of the work you're doing.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. As part of an ongoing project working in democracy and defense of the Constitution, and at the moment it's focused on elections, and we work in social media-based mis and disinformation. So we are tracking these various narratives on social media and reporting on them, and then also where narratives are particularly extreme, like with xenophobia and in the recent insurrection and unrest, we're intervening in those narratives through a blend of content and dialogue interventions as well.
So some of the major issues, and I've already outlined just over the past week some of the headline stories we've been tracking in the news, but some of the major issues identified by social media users to date, what can you tell us?
Well, over the last week, it's spiked again on social media. It's grown to about 32,000 mentions from about 20,000 the week before, and we now have around 15,000 unique authors involved in the conversation. We can expect this to grow as time goes by. So the main three you've alluded to already: the DA posters, particularly around Phoenix, and the 15 million rand stadium, and then Action SA's missing acronym debacle. And then in the background of all of this, mistrust around the reopening of that registration process for candidates.
Ebrahim Fakir, I want to bring you into the discussion here because it's been such an eventful week insofar as just tracking sentiment is concerned around the elections. We know that Twitter is not the universe, but what can we extrapolate from some of the conversations that users have been having?
Well, Michelle, we should be careful not to completely generalize about this. And I think we've been very clear with colleagues from the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change that the findings we're making and the data that we're discussing is certainly not generalizable to the whole population, but it is a snapshot in time, firstly. Secondly, it's indicative, and it's broadly indicative of trends to both sort of voters, political parties, interest groups, and so on. So it is important to note, and I think one of the things which we've picked up, which is quite concerning, is issues around mistrust, broadly in government, firstly, but more specifically with respect to the Electoral Commission. And the Electoral Commission has historically had very high levels of trust, credibility enjoyed with the citizenry. And unfortunately, this election is a little bit different in the sense that their credibility is not as high as it used to be, firstly. Secondly, this narrative, even if it is only on social media, but a lot of stuff these days is germinating there and then finds widespread kind of social traction, firstly, and secondly, it tends to get propounded in the narrative of mistrust of the IEC is driven largely by political parties, and you can't single out any one, but all of them for various reasons, right? Some which need to genuinely scapegoat their poorer than expected performance. So they need to find someone to start blaming in advance, firstly. Secondly, those who are unable to comply with the basic rudiments of the regulatory framework, such as filling out a basic form and answering a question of what is your abbreviation or your acronym, and then making it the problem of the IEC. So that's particularly concerning, and fueling that mistrust was this question of, look, the IEC had this commission set up of inquiry. It says, is a free and fair election possible now? And then they go to apply to court. So they make the argument in court that we're not sure that the conditions are ripe for a free and fair election. And suddenly the election has to be held. So you've already put yourself slightly on the back foot by saying that, it's likely that we can't have it credible, free and fair. And then you say, well, we're going to do our damnedest to ensure that it does happen. I trust that the IEC will be able to execute it. But the assault on their credibility by political parties, I think, is concerning, and it's also partly gaining traction. It's been fueled by the suspicion that the lockdown move to level 1 was purely for political purposes. Let's hope that is not the case and that we're not caught having made the incorrect decision, both to move the country to level 1, but also more importantly to actually hold the election at this time. Yeah,
absolutely. We apologize to our viewers for the shakiness of that connection, Ebrahim, but we're going to try and let it stabilize and bring Stuart Jones back into the conversation. And I wonder, Stuart, we look at the numbers insofar as online conversations are concerned. You talk about mentions when it comes to Twitter. So 32,000 mentions, 14,000 unique authors. This is a month to go, less than a month to go before the elections on the 1st of November. What do these numbers tell us? It is a big increase from the previous week. What does it tell us in terms of engagement with the elections?
Well, it's still quite a small number in comparison. I think there are a few things here. The one is that over the last 3 months, we've had 42,000 unique authors and 200,000 odd pieces of material to look at. So it is still, and that is a pretty sizable conversation. But, there's some conversations that spike at 25,000 a day and have 90,000 unique authors in them. So it's actually relatively small in the greater context of things. I think just to build on Ebrahim's point around social media, we're able to watch Twitter particularly because it's particularly open, but it's a very good early warning system. Very few South Africans are on Twitter, but a lot of the media is on Twitter, and of course the political parties are very engaged on Twitter. And that feeds into the ecosystem that is Facebook, and then into the ecosystem that is WhatsApp, which of course far more South Africans are on. And so what we find is that a radicalization can occur, a sort of incremental radicalization of people through Twitter going into Facebook and into WhatsApp. And, coming into this process, we assumed that there would be attacks on the IEC. That's a classic Trumpian kind of playbook. We really thought that would be coming from perhaps smaller political parties and also from fringe divisive elements like the xenophobic grouping and potentially even the RET forces. But to see it come from mainstream political parties has been really, really disturbing and is quite dangerous, actually, and unfair.
Yeah, in fact, that was my next question to you. The mistrust around the IEC, as you say, driven by these mainstream political parties. Has the IEC responded? I mean, should it be responding, Ebrahim, to the kinds of issues that the big political parties have been raising around its own legitimacy? Should it be responding? Has it responded in the right way?
In the first 2 weeks of our tracking, we were quite sort of disturbed and in some cases even disappointed that the misinformation was not corrected by the IEC. But in the last week, we've seen them come to the fore to explain more forcefully, more clearly, and more articulately, but also simply being present and being able to withstand the assault on their credibility and then putting the facts on the table. Previously, I think because it was all in the realm of perception, it was accusations which were made in the realm of perception, it was harder for them to come out and do so. But there were two particular instances on social media which gathered major traction. The one is that parties making claims that if you don't come out to vote, your vote will automatically go to the party which is in government or the majority party. Now that's classic scaremongering tactics by smaller parties to want to get out their vote, and opposition parties particularly. The second is and there's an element of truth to that, but there's no full truth to it, because in part, when you have a proportional representation system, it's merely those voters of a party who are likely to vote for one party, who, if they don't turn up in the mathematics of a proportional system, show up the share of the other party, even though there isn't a massive migration of votes to them. So there's only a partial element of truth to it. The second claim of misinformation, which is largely out there, is if you don't vote, you lose your right to complain. Well, no. If you don't vote, that's fine. It's nice, it's responsible, it's a good act of citizenship if you do go out to vote. But if in good conscience, ethically you believe you can't and you don't, that's fine. The Constitution makes allowance for that. That doesn't mean that any of your other rights are negated. Your right to complain, your right to moan, your right to expect not just the level of service delivery, but responsiveness and accountability from your representatives. So in short, there's some issues the IEC can't reasonably respond to, and that we accept. But where they must respond to, where blatant misinformation, fake news, false facts, there they need to be much more out there.
Stuart, shall we talk more about the DA's poster debacle of this week? So we had John Steenhuisen out on the campaign trail. He was vehemently, supporting the decision to put up these posters. He says it was in support of the people in that particular area of Durban, in Phoenix, for being responsible South Africans trying to protect their own communities. What kind of a backlash and how much will the DA pay for the decision to, on the one hand, support the posters and on the other hand, then withdraw them with an apology?
Well, that remains to be seen, and I suppose we'll see that in the election results. But it was a classic own goal, and social media responded with fury to all of it, including Steenhuisen's kind of justification of it, and of course has had to backtrack since. So it was enormously insensitive and was responded to accordingly by social media users.
Yeah. Ebrahim, in your article that you've authored with Molebogeng Mokoka, you talk about the power of incumbency, or rather the ANC's attempt to use the power of incumbency. Stuart's just talked about own goals. This one is fitting for what was meant to be a sporting stadium with a collapsing goalpost to the tune of 15 million rand.
Yeah, I mean, the power incumbency is not unique or particular to South Africa. It's governing parties everywhere around the world who coincide big infrastructure projects, or they release and public media campaigns about them, or fast-track delivery, or suddenly start having radio adverts where politicians are much more responsive, accountable, available, and all of that. That's the use of the power of incumbency, particularly when you're using public resources. Of course, you're doing what's mandated by the public service for you to do, but curiously, you suddenly fix potholes, suddenly verges are being cleaned, and so on. So you're using public resources in a way to campaign, a subtle psychological kind of approach. And I think the most blatant one was this week, the past week's release of the stadium, which certainly is subpar in terms of what you would get for 15 million.
To say the least.
And then you have politicians who say things like a lot of work was done underground, undercover, which people can't see. Now, I mean, unless there's some miraculous astroturf beneath the surface of dust, then I wonder where this money has actually gone to. So that was an own goal. But, on this issue of the DA's poster, Michelle, just to return for a moment to it, because it ties in with the kind of misinformation, disinformation, and sometimes distortion of messages. Now, all of these claims, they can't be legally proven. So there's nothing that the IEC, its code of conduct, or the electoral court, or the party liaison committees are going to have to deal with, because there's nothing legally fractious about this. But the nature of the claims are such that they not only ring hollow, they detract from the credibility of what the messaging of the political party. And I think it's backfired on both of them fairly spectacularly.
I want to get your final comments from both of you, in fact, on, as we wrap up our conversation, the issue of mistrust and cynicism ahead of these elections. Stuart, in the work that you've done over the years, do you reckon, given the collection of factors working either for or against political parties, that mistrust, cynicism, these are two things that are particularly high going into these local government polls?
You know, this is a global phenomenon that cuts across multiple areas. I mean, we see this in the vaccine space that we work in as well. Mistrust in authority has grown, mistrust in science, and with it, mistrust in government. So there's a global phenomenon going on around that. But in South Africa, particularly, you know, concerns around corruption, the recent violence, it has really spiked that mistrust in government. And just to go back to the IEC, every time a political party attacks the IEC, we see a direct relationship between that and mistrust in the IEC growing on social media as well. So on one sense, some ambivalence. On one hand, some ambivalence, and on the other hand, some direct mistrust of government, which of course has come with so much over the last few years, talk around corruption and inactivity or incompetence of government. It has now really come to the fore, and especially with that 15 million rand stadium, another own goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Ebrahim, your final comment?
I mean, a sort of creeping crisis of credibility is a universal phenomenon. The problem with this is that in South Africa, it's particularly acute. It has been ongoing for quite some time. Its sustained sort of presence in the political sphere is kind of reaching a point where levels of trust are so low, they're at an all-time low. And when the credibility crisis is as prolonged as it is, and then entrenched, it can start to have an impact on the legitimacy and the exercise of public authority going forward. And that's not something you want, particularly in a democratic government, for a democratic government, and especially when you rely on that democratic government to exercise public power. So a credibility crisis can very easily lurch into a legitimation crisis, and that's certainly quite dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. We know we failed you, but give us another chance. That's certainly a slogan we've heard time and time again. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed for an interesting discussion around various issues as we build up to the local government elections. Ebrahim, Fakir and Stuart Jones, thanks for joining us.